Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 61 of Days Gone By, and this particular episode is another throwback, if you will, to Gran Turismo 4, another vehicle in the classic and also, in this case, vintage category, which is not featured on the game anymore, and also wasn't featured before Gran Turismo 4. And a couple of those cars are pretty cool, and we've featured, obviously, a couple of those already, the Ford Model T, the Daihatsu three-wheeled midget, and also the companion, if you will, to this car, the Daimler motor carriage. But now we've got the Patent Motor Wagen. This is a three-wheeler, of course, whereas the Daimler motor carriage is four, a more conventional layout, and this vehicle has, funnily enough, the larger engine of the two. I would have personally put my money on the Daimler motor carriage having the larger engine because it looks bigger and bulkier, and it is bulkier, it is the heavier of the two, whereas this model only weighs 265 kilos. To say either of them are heavy, though, is kind of an overstatement. Both weigh well under 300 kilos anyway, and the horsepower per tonne on this model totally eclipses the Daimler motor carriage at 3.78 horsepower per tonne compared to 3.45. on the Daimler motor carriage, not per kilo, per tonne. That's pretty low by today's standards. Modern vehicles on Gran Turismo, even some which aren't technically that fast in real life, such as the Tomahawk Vision GT car, they're looking more like that kind of number per kilo, not per tonne. So this is really low. It's basically the lowest car, well, the second lowest, to the Daimler motor carriage in the Gran Turismo franchise in terms of horsepower per tonne. Now, as far as performance, neither this or the other model, the Daimler motor carriage, are what you'd call quick. But of the two, I would give this one the slight edge. It's a little bit quicker, but only by like a couple of points of a mile per hour. There's really not much between them. In terms of manoeuvrability, they're both great because they're not really going quick enough to have bad handling. So, really, there's not much of a difference between the two. There is probably a better one if you actually tried to compare them in terms of lap time, but I haven't and I don't plan to either. In terms of desirability, they're totally different. I personally think I prefer this one of the two. It has a slightly simpler, more, I would say, elegant design, whereas the Daimler motor carriage looks a bit more, well, like a guillotine with wheels. So in comparison, this is more like a park bench meets a penny farthing with an engine on the back. Neither of them are beautiful cars, if you can even call them cars, which you can't really, but what they are is great collector's pieces. Both of the ultra old Merc models, technically not even Mercedes back then, are of course winnable vehicles. You can't buy either of them, and just like with the Daimler motor carriage, I would love if this car came back. But that being said, of course, the chances of it coming back are slim at best. So in terms of comparing the car to something else on the game, well, it only really has that one natural rival of the Daimler motor carriage, and they're not really quick enough to really compare in any kind of racing situation. You could drive them around a track, but even so, there's no point of reference. Nothing else is that slow, so it doesn't really mean very much, even if you did. The only things which you have to work with are the power, the weight, and the engine size. The engine size, as I already mentioned, is larger on this one. It's a single cylinder, but it's a 954cc, which is pretty big for back then, a 1 litre, or close enough, compared to the 462cc, or half a litre, on the Daimler motor carriage. That's not a bad size. That's roughly the same kind of size as a modern day small, say, EcoBoost Ford engine in something like a Ford Ka or a Ford Fiesta. That's not bad for a car from 1886, but of course back then cars did have to have larger engines than they do now to produce the same kind of power, or even similar levels of power. These days, of course, a 1 litre or a half litre, you're going to be producing far more power than that. And to put it into some kind of comparison in the world of Gran Turismo, something like, well, what's about as close to this? The Fiat 500, maybe, the Mitsubishi Minica, that's got something around a 500cc engine, if I remember correctly, 500 or 600, slightly smaller than some of the other K cars, and even then, you're looking at far more power, like 160 times more power, literally. But of course, as I said, it's not really the kind of car that you compare in that way. it's kind of hard to review vehicles like this because there's not much that you can do with them, and they are, at the end of the day, basically just art pieces, drivable art pieces. They are also the kind of vehicle which won't necessarily appeal to everyone, because it just doesn't have that kind of usability that you would typically need from a track car, a race car, or even most other classics or vintage cars. So you can't really review it in that way. It's more just the quirkiness that you're reviewing. And even in the case of a classic or vintage car that is quicker, like a Ford Model T, which in comparison is a monster compared to this, even then, it has such a limited range of use. It can, funnily enough, keep up with some newer vehicles, the really, really low-powered ones, cars which are maybe 50 or 60 years newer in some cases, like the Subaru 360 or the Fiat 500. The Ford Model T actually doesn't fare too badly against cars like that. Other ones, though, like these, well, of course, they're not going to compare at all by modern standards. You'd have to use a modern car with not much power and basically leave it in first gear for it to have a decent comparison. But overall, I personally prefer this, probably, of the two, but both are pretty cool to have on Gran Turismo. And as I said earlier, they're probably not going to come back, very unlikely that they will. And likewise with, unfortunately, the Model T Ford and the Daihatsu Midget, the three-wheeler. It's very unlikely that vehicles like that will return. I highly doubt it for GT Sport. After that, who knows? Maybe, but even then, it hasn't happened already, so the chances get less and less with each new game. Overall, though, it's the kind of vehicle which, as with all of the other unique classics that Gran Turismo 4 had to offer, I would recommend checking it out. If you haven't got the game, of course, it's relatively cheap to pick up Gran Turismo 4, and if you have, and you haven't unlocked the car, then yeah, you should look into it, because it's not the best of track cars, or usable in any way, really, but it's just a cool car to own. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.